Well, hello everybody and welcome to another Calling Conversations. I'm the Reverend Matt Davis, and today we are looking at licensed lay ministries, and they are, well, licensed lay ministries which are licensed by the church, but they are not ordained. They have a special place within the life of the church, ministry to God's people in a myriad of different ways. I'm not going to say too much about that because I'm joined with some fantastic people to tell us about their journey and their calling and their vocation within these things. Jim, Paul and Sarah, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves now, tell them a bit about where they are, what they've been doing, and what particularly they are licensed to do as well. So if it's okay with you, Jim, can you start us off?
Yeah, no problem, Matt. I'm Jim Thompson. I'm part of the ministry team in the Mid-Torvine ministry area. I first started my training into lay ministry in the year 2000. And I had to do 3 lots of licenses in those days. I was a licensed Eucharistic assistant and a licensed Eucharistic minister. And then I became the reader, and which then mutated into the licensed lay minister. So my role really is about supporting and strengthening the ministry and mission that is offered within Mid-Torvine. So I support the laity, which I'm part of. I support the clergy. So is that enough, Matt, for the introduction?
Yeah, we'll get on a bit more about the nuts and bolts of your day today in a bit. So yeah, thank you very much. Paul.
Well, I think Jim has really described quite well in outline what licensed lay ministers do, because like him, I am part of the ministry team across the Monmouth ministry area, which is in the north of the diocese. It's largely rural, and it has 19 churches within it, all of which, of course, at one time, well, I think all of which at one time would have been parishes, certainly benefices before the formation of the ministry area. We have 3 stipendiary clergy to look after the ministry area, supported by a team which extends to retired clergy, self-supporting clergy, and a number of licensed lay ministers. And so through everyone together, we are able to continue providing worship services at the churches throughout the ministry area to support the congregations throughout the area. So that's what we do, and I play a part in that.
And last but not least, Sarah.
Hi. So I guess I started some lay ministry a number of years ago now, but it wasn't licensed. It was doing youth work. And then after a number of years doing that, I moved to the Goitra ministry area, although that's reshaping and looking different now. But at the time I worked around Goitra, which is 5 rural parishes, supporting the priests there, working as a lay Eucharistic minister. So I wasn't a reader, but I assisted with communion services, amongst some other things externally.
Thank you. So one of the key themes of the Calling Conversations panels is obviously calling and getting to the heart of people feeling called and encouraging calling and vocations. And one of the things that we've taken real joy is hearing many people's views on how they've been called and what calling means to them. What would be great to hear from each of you is a bit about how you ended up where you are and what that sort of that journey looked like and what that call looked like, but also what calling specifically means to you as well. And I suppose if it's okay with you, if you can kind of go in a sort of start from a reverse order and start with Sarah on that one, if that's okay.
by all means. So I suppose it would only be fair and transparent to say I am now in an ordinand training to be a priest. But lay ministry, I mean, I think lay ministry is so important, and it was an integral part of exploring a wider vocation. And certainly when I started exploring a calling, it certainly wasn't with a view that it was definitely going to be priesthood. And I definitely went open-minded. I certainly was looking at licensed youth work. I just felt God over those years, I suppose, really, he just opened doors and opportunities that I didn't necessarily seek out. So I ended up in Goitra because I was invited to work over there, because where I was living, that lay ministry wasn't really an option at that time. And I was just very blessed that God put some things in my path, and the priest over in Goitra reached out and invited me to go and work with him. And the amazing thing about vocation is you kind of work it out as you go along. There's not sort of one, you don't go in with just one thing in mind and like, and what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and you think, oh yeah, okay, well, maybe I need to work on that, but actually maybe I should focus on this other stuff because that's where my giftings are. And with any luck, that complements the ordained team, who equally have some gifts that you might not, but equally you've got the gifts that they don't have. And so it's that collaborative working it was integral for exploring calling and listening to where God was taking you and doing.
Right. Well, I think I better follow on from Sarah. I guess my path has been quite different. I became a Christian when I was 18, which is now not far short of 50 years ago. And I sort of grew up in, if you like, an evangelical tradition, because I became a Christian at university. So what one did was to sit around and read the Bible and go to meetings and hear lots of sermons, particularly about sin. Evangelical theology is very, very strong on sin, and certainly it resonated with me at that particular time. But much more important was getting into the practice of reading the Bible with others. And I think I can say that for most of my life since then, once a week, almost every week, except when I've been on holiday or been traveling or whatever, I have met with a group of other Christians, normally from my own church, to sit and read the Bible together. And the practice of doing that, and of course, reading it by oneself in one's own personal devotions, I think has probably shaped me more than anything else in my life, because it is through the Bible that we, first of all, come to know Jesus. And it's through reading the Bible with other people, with other Christians, that we find ourselves sharing our deepest experiences. So there is an extraordinary revelation and intimacy which reading the Bible involves. And I think that's why at the end of Hebrews, the writer says, the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, and penetrates to the joints between bone and marrow, or whatever it is. And that pattern of daily Bible reading continued. And I would normally, in sort of middle age, find myself using daily Bible notes in my private devotions, which at that time were written by Selwyn Hughes, who many of you, I guess, will have heard of, but who was a wonderful Welsh minister and evangelist and produced Bible notes. And one day, Selwyn died and there were no more Bible notes. And so I had to read the Bible on my own. I didn't use notes. I decided that I was going to try Lectio Divina, where you sit and read a passage and you just meditate on it. You don't look at what somebody else has been saying about it. And I did that again and again, but focusing on the Gospels. And I would read the Gospels over and over and over again. And it's through reading the Gospels, I think, that you really get to know Jesus. And so one hears the voice of Jesus calling, because as you read one Gospel, you think of something you've read in another. And one day I got to the point where I was in Luke's Gospel, and I came across these words at the end of a section on watchfulness. And the words were, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." And I felt at that point that I had been given many years of the privilege of reading the Bible and coming close to Jesus. And that having been given that privilege, that it was something that I ought to do something about. It had been encouraged by other people because many would say to me or to my wife, "Oh, Paul, you really ought to go into the church." I would hate it when people said that. I would feel very embarrassed and very unworthy and think, no, I want to get on with my career. And I'm a lawyer and I'm still a lawyer. So I still do that. And maybe that's a feature of lay ministry we can talk about later. But that was the beginning of the calling. And so the essence of the calling for me is about doing my best to explain what is in the Bible and doing my best to tell people about Jesus.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think following on from Paul, where Paul became Christian at 18, I describe myself as a cradle Christian. That doesn't mean to say I've always been a member of the church in Wales. My dad was a Methodist. My mother was Church in England. And depending on which church gave the best trip to the seaside or the best books out at anniversary, determined whether I went to chapel or went to church. That's the background. But then when I started my career, I'm a nurse. And when I first started being faced with death and things like that, there was an urge or a calling, if you want, to go back to church on a much more regular basis, because through my teenage years, I lapsed. So I went back to church. And then I remember my father-in-law in the 1975, 76 said, when you go to church, whatever you do, don't get involved. That was his message to me. Don't get involved. But you start because you become a sides person, you do the readings, you become a member of the PCC, and you just drift into the church, as it was. And I remember some very prominent clergy members at a meeting I used to be on, and I was getting a little irate because, in my view, the professional laity were getting all the good jobs, and the laity like me, who were new to it, weren't. But a lot of people will now say I'm professional laity because I seem to be on everything. So it's quite interesting about how that actually evolves through. But I think the calling is about your knowledge, your skills, and your talents, and how we use those as individuals. Whether I use them in work or whether I use them in the church, it was about, in my view, being this living disciple of Christ and doing work that supported his church, his people, and the communities in which we are based. And I think that's an important part of that thing about how and what you do. And whether it was me dressed in a church lads, church girls brigade uniform, banging the big bass drum out of tune on our parade days, that was part of the calling, or whether it was reading in church, making paper change to go around the church for children in need or whatever. There was always something going on that links church to community. And I think that was the start of my calling, was about, I had to be part of that. And that's how it's evolved through, really.
Thank you. Thank you. So what would be good to hear now, I think, is a bit about what exactly you get up to in your roles, because I think it's something which is important to hear, and I think it's something which may need a bit of demystifying as well, is that it's I don't think it is just taking it's not just taking communion to people, and there's can be a bit more to it than that as well, and not that isn't important, because of course that is important, and that has its own rewards and merits to it as well, and has some of the most deeply significant times of people's lives is that service that the church provides. But it'd be great to hear some stories and some sort of your, I suppose, obviously not day to day, but your sort of your ministry. What are your roles and what are your responsibilities, and the things which really enliven you in your roles as they are now? I'll open.
Well, I'm happy to start with that. It varies from the seasons in the church's year, from week to week, and what it is. Post-COVID, in COVID, before COVID, it's impacted on the type of ministry I can do. I have been doing morning prayer and evening prayer across the ministry area through as lockdown's been easing. Through the lockdown, every Sunday with two other members of the laity, we put on a Zoom all-age worship, which involved prayer, the Bible story, and then an activity and a scavenger hunt, and there's all sorts of things we've done. What was interesting with that is, although we did it from our own homes, is that we were joined by 5 families from Cardiff. So it was interesting that it wasn't just about the ministry to the communities in which we lived. Other communities wanted to see what we were doing, and that was quite interesting, really, about how that worked through. Yes, I've done communion by extension, but it's about getting that balance right in regard to what other ministries we do. I do a communion by extension service in a local nursing home, normally outside COVID. I assist the clergy in funerals, done that. Last year for Nativity, we coordinated a Zoom nativity play. So all the families were given a role or a character, and they had to do a poem or a reading or something, and we then spliced it all together to make the nativity story. So we've done that. I've assisted and led family services, things like remembrance services, for very involved with and supporting St. David's Hospice in our ministry area. So that when they gave up their life for life, we brought in a memorial remembrance service to replace that. So that was very well supported. So there's all sorts of different ministries we do. And the other one is you become the listening ear to people in the congregation. And sometimes they come to you rather than go to the clergy. And it's about then making that balance about, is it something you can deal with, or is it something that needs to be passed on to the clergy who we are supporting in ministry and mission in the area, really? So it's a lot. And then the other things that link into, and whether it's lay ministry or not, I believe it is links with Eden Gate in Newport, Night Shelter, Women's AIDS Refuges, collections for Track 2, the Eastern Valley Food Bank. I and some other ladies coordinate all that, as well as doing the lunch bags for Eden Gate once every 6 weeks. So that's part, we see that, and I see that part of my ministry, because it's utilizing the knowledge, skills, and talents. It's about what you can do to further enhance your licensed lay ministry. So in our parish, because we've got a big church hall, I had to go off and do my food supervisor's certificate course, because we do a community lunch. And I am the coordinator of the community lunch. So I've got to get the right qualifications. So it's not just having the license that the bishop gives to do the church services. It's about developing your knowledge and skills much wider than that. And it also is about how you link with other churches and chapels in your area for churches together, for example. So it's about looking at things like that. So that's roughly, there's a lot to do, but every week I probably do 2 to 3 services, and we'll do services with at least 2 reflective sermons in. But yeah, it's an interesting time, really.
Mm.
I think that it's very interesting what Jim has said. I'm still relatively new to this because I've only been licensed since October last year. So I've been doing this for, I think, probably not quite 9 months, about 9 months. So I'm still very much feeling my way. I think it's very much, if you are a licensed lay minister, it's what you make of it and how much time you can give to it. There will be particular requirements and needs in your locality, which one hopes one will be able to address. For myself, as I say, as part of the ministry area team, it really has focused on, I guess, preaching and teaching. In my work, I have a very full-time day job. Well, it's more than a day job, really. It's quite often a day and night job, which leaves me very little time to do other things. And if any of you listening have very busy jobs and you're saying to yourself, I couldn't possibly do this because my job doesn't give me the time to do it, well, just think very carefully about that, because often with sort of discipline and organization, you can make the time to do the studying and the training. And I was in a group with Sarah a couple of years ago, which was wonderful. And the people you meet doing the training are wonderful. Once you've got through that and you are licensed, then, as I say, I think as Jim has explained, you can make of it really what you want, because there are always needs. Because of the particular nature of my work and the time that it allows me, and what I have to give to it, I find that my focus at present is on preaching and teaching on the one hand, and on the other hand, this thing I have about Bible studies and prayer groups, it's being a member of a weekly Bible study, which meets over a meal to study the word and to pray. And I think it took me a very long time to appreciate. And if you think about Acts and Paul's letters in the New Testament, you can see that this was very much the model of the early church. The early church was essentially a house church, and a house church grew from little groups. So there were house groups. And what those groups did was to have a meal. They would read the scriptures, which at that time probably were the Old Testament scriptures for us, the Hebrew Bible, and they would pray together. That was the kind of occasion when the young man fell out of the window when Paul was speaking at such length. But those kinds of activities, when Christians gather to do this, they form a very close bond, which in my belief and experience gives tremendous power and muscle to the church. It undergirds the church, that fellowship of laity, because the clergy cannot be, they can be at some of those meetings, but they can't be there very much. But it provides opportunities for pastoral ministry, opportunities for prayer, to support the clergy in prayer, to support the mission of the church in prayer. And in my very simple view, if all churches had these house groups where you met to study, preferably to eat together when we can do that, and to pray, to have time together, to get to know each other better, that will do a great deal to strengthen your own faith and the witness of the whole body of Christ. So I guess those are the two things. So it's, for me, it's preaching and teaching and being part of that house group Bible study structure. And obviously there are many other things, as Jim was saying, that you can do and that I look forward to doing when I have more time.
So I suppose being licensed in the middle of a pandemic isn't exactly the opportune time to start anything. It's done well to do what you've got. So yeah, Sarah.
Well, following on from what Paul said, I'm a massive believer in home groups and small groups. And one of the things I did when I was working as a lay minister, albeit you don't need to be licensed to run or lead a small group. I would just say that. I'd encourage anyone to start one. I led one, albeit it was in a pub. So rather than meeting in a freezing cold church, and no one was able to host it, which is not an uncommon problem, we decided that we would go and we'd meet in the local pub every fortnight. And the place where that particular group were at wasn't necessarily for a deep level sort of Bible study, but we called it Pondering a Pint. And we just looked at the issues of the day, you know, the current affairs, what was happening in the world. And we just kind of apply our Christian faith to it and look at it through our Christian lens and discuss how we might respond to it. And the fabulous thing about doing it out in the open is that the locals in the pub kind of could hear you talking, and they know who you are and they know where you're from. And I quite enjoyed, if I'm honest, that kind of witness. Again, a bit like Jim, I did a lot of the kind of standard things as a lay minister in terms of assisting with the chalice on an ordinary Sunday alongside the priest, which was an incredibly humbling experience, more than I ever realized. I think when you're so used to the Sunday and it's so familiar and you kind of know what goes on, but when you're on the other side of that rail, it makes you think and see it through a very, very different lens. But yeah, I would do that. I would lead Eucharist by extension. I did work full time, and I was very blessed that I had a job that was flexible in terms of my hours. So I could every now and again take a few hours off and go and lead midweek Eucharist by extension. And I also, again, you don't need to be licensed to do this, did school assemblies every month, which was such a blessing. I really enjoyed going into that, and probably pushed my skills, because actually I probably felt much more comfortable preaching on a Sunday, which is something that I was enabled to do on a fairly regular basis. What else? Oh, actually, one of the highlights of my weeks, every Sunday, I would spend my lunch times going to visit one of the local mental health hospitals. So it was a secure unit with adult males. And we'd go in, visit the staff and patients. and spend time talking to the staff, checking in on how they are, and then spending time with the patients, having lunch, Sunday lunch with them. And some of them had the desire to speak to you about God. Some of them just wanted to chat to you about their weeks, and but some of them wanted, there is a prayer room in this, and that's probably true of most hospitals. And that was a real blessing as well. So I think the thing with lay ministry, I think Paul's right. You can do as much or as little as you're able to give. I think you need to be disciplined. I think it's very easy because a lot needs. There's always something to be done, but you do need to take care of yourself as well. And if you have to say no and you can't do it, that's okay. But you can still do something. I'm not trying to say, oh, don't do lay ministry, but you don't have to do it all. So actually, if what you're gifted in is children, focus on that. Or if actually you're an amazing teacher, focus on preaching. Or pastoral skills. You can do chaplaincy work. There is something for everyone. And I think I came to faith in my 20s, and admittedly I came to faith within a non-conformist background. And so from the start, I was taught that everybody has a place in ministry. It isn't just for priests. Everybody's got a part to play. We are all called to do something, and we need to listen to what that is. And yeah, we shouldn't be putting it all on our priests. The priests have got a role to play, without a doubt, but lay people, the church can't function without lay people. They're fundamental, but it's part of our faith. It's part of our calling, to God.
And I think sometimes, picking up from what Sarah said, you get hung up with labels sometimes. And I think what we need to do as a church is actually look at how we can foster lay vocation in our church, and whatever format that takes. Is I remember with one incumbent, they found out I used to be in the leadership agency of NHS Wales, and was very used to action learning. So they asked me to do the Living Faith course as action learning every week throughout the year. And they sat in the audience, as it were, or the group. And there it was me with my action learning models and my inclusive activities, getting them to do it. And it's quite interesting but then other people then said, oh, I could do something on that. And it's about opening doors, isn't it? It's about, actually, it's not the constraints of the church. A lot of the constraints to lay ministry is the people themselves. They've got a lot of knowledge and skills, and it's about opening that door. I think Philip mentioned it, Paul mentioned it earlier. It's about opening that door for them to see, actually, there is a role within the church that you can, perhaps you're not a leader, but you're definitely a supporter. You can help people go through some of that learning with a qualified person or a lay minister. So that's important, I think, sometimes.
I think also, Jim, I would want to add to that I am acutely conscious, and I think all of us who are members of the church should be, of how pressed the clergy are. Because if you think about the history of the Church of England and now the Church in Wales, the Church in Wales, of course, was disestablished in 1921, which had, to an extent, the effect of impoverishing it. We live in a world where church congregations have declined, where the income of the church has declined, where the number of clergy has declined, and where the pressures that exist on those who are clergy to keep running what was a fairly comprehensive parish structure, which operated reasonably well, or well enough, when there were more clergy and when there was more money, that situation is now gone. And I think that there is a duty on the laity, on all members of the laity, to do what they can. You may not be able to do very much, but to do as much as you reasonably can in order to build up the church and to support the clergy. And so, as I was saying earlier, I think that one of my incentives for exploring vocation was to see whether I could do something to help. What I recognised in my benefice then, because I used to live in England at that point, were clergy who were very, very hard pressed and constantly having to juggle with rotas and meet all kinds of unexpected pastoral demands. We need to help our clergy as laity, and becoming a licensed lay minister is one of the ways you can do that. As Sarah was saying, you don't have to be licensed to have a lay ministry, but if you embark on the training and the vocation before you enter onto the training, it is actually very, very challenging, and it's great fun. I wouldn't have met Sarah but for doing it. My life has been hugely enhanced and enriched by those fellow members, because lay ministers do some of their training alongside ordinands, those who are going to be ordained. And that's wonderful. The Church in Wales has become very good at organising its training sessions through the ministry of St Padden's, which used to be the College of St Michael's at Llandaff, now operates all of Wales. There's virtual learning. There are venues all over Wales. It really is a wonderful and very stimulating thing to do. It will increase the number of people you know. It will develop your faith. It will challenge you. So in all of those ways, it's a very worthwhile thing to explore, above and on top of this sense that I believe we all should have, that we must do all we can, reasonably can, to help our clergy. Because after all, Sarah was saying, without the laity, there's no church. Without the clergy, there's no church. We are all members of one another. We need each other. And what our nation and what the whole world desperately needs is simply Jesus. The whole world needs to know Jesus. If it did, then, you know, there would be this transformation, which is what we all long to see. We see the suffering in the world. We see the misery. We see climate change because of human exploitation of the world. We see terrible, tyrannous regimes. These are things that must be changed. And it's only really the Christian faith and its transcultural nature and its love and its openness, its message grounded in love, that can change it. And we are all part of that.
With like community in mind, actually, it's made me think how there's a longevity that lay ministers can have within their communities that is not always afforded to priests, because, you know, whether we like it or not, priests are often moved around. They're not there, you know, for 20 years. Very rare.
You mean like me?
Sorry, Jim. But, you know, what a blessing, because actually, if we're talking about being that light, if we're talking about working with our communities and being visible and sharing God's love and the gospel, actually being able to do that as lay people in a community over a sustained period of time, rather than just being the latest person who might be there for 5 years and then they're moved on. You know, I think there's a real value to that. That shouldn't be overlooked. And
the laity, sorry, Sarah, the laity provide the continuity to the community.
Yeah. Not that I'm doing a disservice to priests.
No, not at all. But the reality is that, as you say, people change.
Yeah.
But there is some constant within a community, and that could be the congregation. And, you know, it's understanding that lay ministry, not necessarily licensed lay ministry, but lay ministry could be people reading the intercessions, doing the readings. There's all sorts of things that can be done that support the services and the ministry of our church. And it's about making people aware that, you know, we're not, it's nothing major is going to happen to them. It's just getting involved, really.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the most important ones, which people often dismiss as fairly trivial, you know, oh, I can't really do, you know, you'll have people come up to you and you'll be, oh, I can't really do lay ministry, oh, I can't preach, or, you know, I don't want to robe and do the chalice, oh, but, you know, I can make cups of tea if you like. And actually, the hospitality, the people on the doors, the welcomers, the people who make cake and do, that is such an invaluable ministry, which people put down so much, and I just can't encourage enough.
And I think that's an important one, because as well as the cup of tea, everybody, the majority of people, have got the ability of speech and can talk. Yeah. So through COVID, we brought in telephone cascade system for each of our churches. So one member of the congregation who was able and could do it would ring 3 people. And then those 3 people could ring somebody else. So the message from the church it might have been just saying, how you doing? You know, are you doing okay? Do you need any shopping? Do you need something? That's ministry.
Yeah, everyone can do something. You don't have to be really educated. You don't have to be well spoken, from a good back, you know, there is literally, we are all called to serve God, and he has gifted us with something to use.
Yes, I mean, we should never forget that hospitality is one of the gifts of the Spirit. If you think about Jesus in the Gospels, so much of what Jesus did was done over food. So those of you who are good cooks, which I'm not, you have this ministry. You have this ministry of hospitality, and it's a huge thing. There was one thing that Jim said that I just wanted to pick up on about intercessions, and he made a very important point there. I found that intercessions, if you're asked to do them for a service, first of all, it takes quite a weight off whatever pressure there may be for that service on the clergy, because the clergy are then free of having, to an extent at any rate, of having to think about that particular part of the service themselves if one does the intercessions. When you do something where you're up front, and if you're listening with a view to licensed lay ministry, I guess you are all at least reasonably okay about doing that. But when you do something up front, you have to think about what you're doing, what you're going to say. And there's a great responsibility also in praying, because it's part of leading corporate worship. And there is a high responsibility which it involves. But when you actually sit down to do it, and when you write prayers, I think you will find that the person who gets maybe most out of it will actually be you, because you are getting face to face with God. You are thinking yourself into that service. Lord, what can I say in this service that is going to help those present, that will support the clergy, support the theme of the service, support whatever is the focus of that particular week? What can I do? And when you sit down and you go through the discipline of writing prayers for a service, it will change you, as it will change you when you stand up and do it. And when you stand up and do it, it's important to pray the prayers with everybody rather than just to read them. But I found that over the years had a huge impact on me. And whether or not you want to go actually explore licensed lay ministry in your ordinary lay ministry, this is something that you can do. And it's a wonderful thing to do and a great privilege.
Definitely.
And there is a lot of support out there, isn't there? You know, Paul's spoken quite a bit about the training for lay licensed ministers. So what were readers? And, you know, St. Padans, you know, takes that incredibly seriously. They're not an add-on. They're not a lesser type of priest or a lesser type of student. You know, they are, you know, the study is literally the same. The courses are exactly the same as what the priests do academically. So, which might sound daunting to some, but it's all accessible. And I would encourage that, actually, because if there are people out there who are thinking about lay licensed ministry and thinking, oh gosh, doing theology for life is what's used, and there's level 4, 5, and 6, and if you go all the way through to 6, you get a degree. That might sound really daunting, but actually the amount of support that's provided by the institution to enable anybody from any background, with or without any academic previous experience, I think people will be very surprised at what they're capable of completing. The support is definitely there. I would just encourage that not to be a barrier.
I've got to say, I'm a vocation advisor. So the support people get when they first think about going into lay ministry, they're allocated a mentor, and there's a lot of there's forms to fill, and we know what people like forms or they hate forms. But there's people like me. There's two of us are laity, rest are clergy, but that's how it works, or 3 are laity. So it's quite interesting about getting people to look at what they do every day, every Sunday perhaps, and get them to think about, actually, what does that hymn mean? What words from the Bible have been used in that hymn which you find joyous? Why and how is that impacted on your calling? And it's getting people to understand they're probably doing it in a subconscious level every Sunday. And sometimes it's about how you bring it out in them to say, actually, let's look how we can foster that and develop your lay ministry, whether it's licensed or not. But it's about, you've got that knowledge base within you, but you just don't realize it sometimes.
I think it's a really interesting point, thinking about the training and what you said about that drawing things out of people as well, is that and thinking about where you've come, is that it's this isn't a stopping place for ordained ministry. This is a distinct thing, and actually it's I think it's quite, just hearing from what you've said, but also knowing people I know who are in these roles, it's an empowering thing as well, because there's so many people that it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. There's so many people I know who, unfortunately, the church has sometimes disempowered them, where they're in positions like, but all of you, even as you,
I think, Matt, that's quite,
and so like very capable, and as soon as they walk through a church door, they suddenly lose all their acquired skills and knowledge, and suddenly it's like they become someone else. And actually it's saying that actually you do have these skills, these talents and everything else, but you don't have to become this person you're not, to have a role in the church. If you feel God's calling you to something, to something more, there is a place for you here.
Yeah, I think it's about how you get individuals to be themselves. It's not an act. It's a calling. It's what I do. It's about my knowledge, my skills, my talents. Now, I fully accept not everybody might like that. They want a vicar with a dog collar at the front. That's fine. But if I've got the knowledge, the skills, and I can engage, then I think that's part of my role as a lay minister, being able to develop that. It's not, we are not in competition. We are together. We are a team. We're in a partnership. Some of that partnership are ordained. Some of us are licensed lay ministers, but the other part of the partnership are the laity, the congregations, who need to develop their roles and follow perhaps their vocations. So it's quite an interesting one, that one.
So we've got a few minutes left before we wrap things up. I just wondered what would be good to think about just as we close is was 2 things mainly. Is what advice would you give someone who is thinking about licensed lay ministry who may have sparked something in their mind and said, actually, this is something I'm thinking about already. What would you say to them? And maybe in that, what's something you may have wished you would have known before you'd gone into this journey? You know, what's something, you know, what's a pothole which you wish someone would have told you to avoid, or something like that. And is there any last words of wisdom you would like to share with us before we close, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose starting backwards now, my words of wisdom is do really listen and try to discern, try to work out what it is that your gift is and what it is that God's calling you to do. It's really easy, and I've made this mistake of simply plugging a gap that exists in the church. So they desperately needed a Sunday school teacher for 7 and 8 year olds, and I was like, oh, okay, well, I can, you know, I've got the time, I'm free, I can do it. It was ridiculous. It was not my calling. It is not my gifting. It's, you know, I just felt like I was entertaining children, and then it's difficult though then to step back and go, oh, sorry guys, I can't do this. But you need to be honest with yourself and just be listening to what it is that you are called to do, and don't just do it because you think no one else will. Because actually, after a while, the vacuum will fill itself, and you know, God. I'm a big believer that God provides. So something just because of a gap. Do what it is that you're called to do. So yeah, I wish I'd known that. Oh gosh, what was the other one, Matt? Sorry.
So last words of wisdom, you've got that one down. Then it's what was there something you wish you knew before you went into this? Is there anything you would tell someone who was thinking about licensed lay ministry? Is there you know, what advice would you give?
Just do not just have confidence. Do not think you can't do something, because if God is calling you to do it, he will equip you with what you need. He will clear any obstacles out of your path, and just be bold in stepping out, and don't hesitate to ask people, get in touch with people. There is so much support out there around the diocese that you can do it. It can be done. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thank you. Paul?
I think the first thing I'd say, if you're interested in finding out more about becoming a licensed lay minister, is to, first of all, try to speak to any licensed lay ministers you know, or whom you can ask to be put in touch with. I think that anybody who is an LLM should regard it as part of their responsibility to talk to others who are interested. So even if you don't know somebody yourself, ask perhaps the diocesan office, perhaps your vicar, or whoever may be appropriate, if you can be put in touch with someone who is an LLM, so you can talk to them about it. And once you've found out something about the role, talk about it to those you know well, your friends, fellow members of your congregation, perhaps, and see how they react to it, and just allow time to reflect on it. I think those are the things I would say, and also read what you can about it. When I expressed an interest in vocation, one of the first things that happened to me, this wasn't in the Diocese of Monmouth, but I was given an enormously long reading list, which I was told I would be expected to have known quite a lot of, as and when I got to any interview. So you can, you know, I don't know whether the Diocese of Monmouth does that, maybe it ought to. But you can read books on reader ministry. So there is one, for example, by Paula Gooder on reader ministry, what you can do. The other thing in terms of words of wisdom, I think is this: you will find it more stretching and more demanding than you probably ever thought before you took it on. And you might say to yourself, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have volunteered for this in the first place. Because you are a volunteer. You are doing this on a voluntary basis. I think those who are stipendiary clergy, although they're not volunteers, they have given up a huge thing, which is life as a layperson, to commit themselves and very publicly to wear the collar that Matt is wearing. And wearing that can be a sign of welcome and recognition, but it can also be an invitation in some circumstances where you meet hostility and aggression. It's a very major, courageous step to take, which licensed lay ministry doesn't involve to the same extent, but it will challenge you. And one of the reasons it will challenge you is because you find you have to do things that you weren't expecting to do. In my particular case, I find I've had a really hard week at work, and then I have to preach on Sunday, and I don't have a lot of time to prepare the sermon. I'm very conscious how difficult it must be for clergy to find time, adequate time, to prepare sermons, because it's not an easy thing to do, to preach a sermon. You need to be guided by the Spirit. You need to understand the word that it is you're preaching, the whole structure of the service, with the passage on which, or passages on which you're preaching is built around. So it will be challenging. But what I can say to you is that it's really the principle of that verse that Jesus says, to those who have, more will be given, and to those who have not, even what they have will be taken away. If you have faith and you have to work at your ministry, in whatever form it takes, you will find that your faith will develop. You will see more of God. You will learn more about God. God will grow inside you. And that is the greatest gift that any of us, I think, can ever hope to have, because life is a journey. The journey starts with birth, and it sort of reaches a milestone or a landmark point at death. For those who have no hope in God, that is a very, very difficult and frightening point. But I think for those of us who do have that hope, what we need to do is to grow in our faith, that as our life draws on, we see more and more of God at work in ourselves and in the world, and that our faith deepens, so that as we approach that time, a lot of us now are singing that song by Matt Redman about 10,000 blessings. And the last verse is about the last day, and I know my time has come. Well, that time one day will come, but we, all of us, want to be at a point where our faith in God has really, really deepened. And I can promise you that if you explore this and you go on with it, yes, it will challenge you, but it will also hugely increase and develop your faith.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jim.
I like to echo Paul's word, because about where you go for information. Always start with your incumbent. Sometimes it's the congregation saying you should think about going forward in lay ministry. So talk to your incumbent, your ministry area leader. You've got Reverend Rebecca Stevens as Director of Vocations. You've got John Collier, Goitrafau, who can advise. Is very, he came up through lay minister. So there's lots of people, and there's people, as Paul says, like us. So you can ask us. We're not ogres. You can get our details from the Dawson office or something. That would be that's really fine. I think it's giving yourself time to think. You sitting down, praying, opening your heart. Let the Holy Spirit come and let him start to work through your journey on the path that God's created for you. And God will have made you that path. And it's about listening to God, and working through, well, what has he got in store for me now? If I had the hindsight, being a licensed lay minister for 20 years is something I never, ever thought I do, but I am, and I accept that because I think it's God's path for me. I love the work I do. I love being a living disciple of Jesus Christ, and I love doing things that he wants me to do here on his earthly kingdom. So I'm quite happy with my lot, as it were. But picking up on something Sarah said about plugging the gap is you have to work in the team and as partnership, because lay ministry is not a polyfiller ministry. It's not just plastering over the gaps because there isn't a clergy there for this week or next week. It's about true ministry. And I think I'm not a polyfiller minister. I am a licensed lay minister, part of a partnership, part of a team. That is important. And as for legacy, my legacy, I hope, as a licensed lay minister, is that I leave communities and churches that are vibrant and reactive to the needs of each other.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for all your contributions. And I think that's summed it up nicely, saying not licensed lay ministers, not polyfiller ministers, parts of teams, vibrant people who bring so much joy, life, and enthusiasm, and much needed ministry to our churches, ministry areas, and souls as well. And it's been great to have Jim, Paul and Sarah with us to share some of their journey, some of their experience as well this evening. If you've found this a tantalizing conversation and you're thinking, licensed lay ministry, that's me, then as always has been mentioned, then please do explore it more. You can do that in the ways already been mentioned by speaking. Paul and Jim have already offered, I think, in saying that they're fine to contact, and you can find their details by contacting Zoe in the Dyson office, and also you can contact Reverend Becca Stevens and the vocations team, and also your own incumbents and ministry area leaders, to start a conversation about what it means to be a licensed lay minister. Our next calling conversations after an August break, me and Becca will be going on holiday and also just taking a break like everyone else will be doing. So we're not having one over August, unfortunately. We'll be back in September the 28th, where we look at lay vocations, people who are out in the world, not licensed, but feeling like God's called them to their own specific ministries in the world, well, not even ministries, careers and paths, whether that's being doctors, nurses, lawyers, whatever shape that takes, and feels like God, that is where God has placed them. Right there, and we'll be taking part in that on September the 28th, in a few weeks' time. It's been great to be with you all. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope you all have a good evening. And if you have any more questions or, like I said, want to find out more, then please do be in touch. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Bye-bye.